The reading and the study are very long, so the reading has been omitted.
Chapter 4, verse 44, through to chapter 6, verse 9. Page 176 in the Old Testament. Chapter 4, verse 44. If you've got a little picture there of Moses holding up the two tables of stone. Have you ever thought of the weight of two stones that size? We don't know if they were that size, but they must have been quite big to have all 10 commandments written on both of them. Let me just remind you of what I said a fortnight ago, that when treaties were made in the ancient world, there were always witnesses, 2 witnesses, who had to sign the treaty, just as 2 witnesses sign our wedding register today. And there were always 2 copies of the treaty made, and you may be interested to know that we have 2 wedding registers here. 2 copies are made with the names of the 2 witnesses on both. 1 copy is kept in a fireproof safe somewhere in the corner of the building there, and the other copy goes to Somerset House. So these 2 tablets of stone, which must have been quite sizable, and very heavy and very burdensome, and I'm going to make a point about that later, would have the 10 commandments on both of them. But the names of the witnesses were not there because Moses called heaven and earth to witness the treaty between God and men. And the law was that the treaty held good as long as the witnesses lived. If you remember seeing that dramatic film, Peace Child, do you remember that, or have you read the story? The treaty between the 2 warring tribes held as long as the peace child lived. And therefore God's treaty with men, made through Moses, lasts as long as heaven and earth last. And the witnesses are still with us today. Now let's read the Word of God. Moses gave God's laws and teachings. No, I'm going to start verse 41. I missed those out last time, didn't I? Father, all you really need is a mouth. Sometimes you deign to use our minds as well, but all you need is a mouth. And I open my mouth now and ask you to fill it, and ask you to speak to us in a way we can understand, and to lead us to the point where the words we've sung are the truth, and that your commandments are sweeter than honey. Lord, we may be a very long way from that this morning, some of us. Others of us, you've just begun to show us how sweet it is to do your will. Lord, speak to us through your word this morning. We're listening. And Lord, may we not give you the sadness of saying, I wish they always felt like this. May we always be ready to listen and to obey. For Jesus' sake. Amen. As soon as I realized this morning we were going to speak about the 10 Commandments, a whole lot of experiences and stories which I've used before from this pulpit came flooding back. I'm just going to remind you of 3 of them. They all just give me a little introduction to them. The first memory that comes back to me vividly is the time when I was a Royal Air Force chaplain and had to interview all the new intake, maybe 70 or 80 young men straight from home, come into the RAF as apprentices. And I used to begin the session with them by saying, how many Baptists are there here? And a few hands would go up. How many Methodists? How many Presbyterians? And so on. Because the system is that the C of E got first pick, and he usually got 85% because those 2 magic letters appeared on most arrival cards. And then the Roman Catholic got about another 5%. And then all the rest were handed over to me. We were the other denominations, the odd bods as they called us, the ODs. And we got agnostics, atheists, Muslims, Jews, and just everything. We even got those who tried to get away with the word Christian, which was illegal and unofficially recognized. But since the word Christian wasn't accepted by the other 2 chaplains, I got those too. And I was very glad to get them. And then after asking this, and their hands went freely up, in the same tone of voice, I said, and how many Christians here? And then there was a horrible pause. I said, come on, how many Christians are there here? You told me how many Methodists, how many Baptists. Well, I'd like to know how many Christians. Sometimes a boy with a beaming face would shoot his hand up straight away, and I was just so glad. But most times, their hands sort of came off the knee about 2 inches and went down again when they saw nobody else was raising their hand. And so I'd just wait in silence, and then one little lad would say, well, what do you mean by a Christian? I would say, well, what do you mean? And invariably they said, well, someone who keeps the 10 Commandments. I said, great, that's a great definition of a Christian. How many Christians are there here? There's sort of, terrible hesitation. They would look at each other, and then after a long pause, somebody would say, oh, Padre, nobody can keep them all. I said, okay, what's pass mark? And they always chose 6 out of 10. I don't know if this was a hangover from school days as to what was pass mark then for school certificate as it was then, or what? Or credit mark, was it? But anyway, they said 6 out of 10. I mean, it's unreasonable to expect anybody to pass 10 out of 10. So 6 out of 10, just over halfway. So I said, fine, that's a great definition of a Christian, someone who keeps 6 out of 10 commandments. How many Christians are there here? Well, 6 is a bit high, maybe, I used to say. Well, let's bring it down to 3. I mean, that would be very gracious of God to say, okay, if you get 3 out of 10 right, you're in. How many Christians are there on 3? And still they would hesitate. And we would go on like this until finally they would say what I was wanting them to say all along. Padre, what do you think a Christian is? And I would say, I'll tell you what the pass mark is. Wait for it, it's going to be an awful shock to you. The pass mark is 10 out of 10. Anything less than that is not going to be good enough. And that really shook them. And you say, well, that's it then. And they would keep all their hands down. Unless there was a real Christian and he was still prepared to put his hand up. That's the interesting thing. Even though the pass mark was 10 out of 10. Because you see, the great difference between the Old Testament is not that the Old Testament has the 10 Commandments and that in the New Testament they've been abolished. Never, never fall into that trap. I'll just read you one verse from the New Testament which will deal with that straight away. And it's here. Jesus said, do not think that I have come to do away with the law of Moses and the teachings of the prophets. I have not come to do away with them, but to make them come true. Now that's the good news. Remember that as long as heaven and earth last. Now why should Jesus say that? Because they were the 2 witnesses to it. Do you remember? Remember that as long as heaven and earth last, not the least point nor the smallest detail of the law will be done away with, not until the end of all things. Could anything be plainer? Never listen to a preacher who says the 10 Commandments have been done away with. The good news is not that they've been abolished, but that Jesus has come to make them come true. That's good news. You see, in the Old Testament, all they could tell you was what you were supposed to do. And your heart said, yes, I know I'm supposed to do that. And my conscience says I haven't done it. And my mind says I never will do it. But the New Testament comes not to tell us so much what to do. We've got all that. The New Testament comes and Jesus says, I'll tell you how to do it. That's great. Or if I can put it another way, I've heard preachers speak on the text, we are not under law but under grace, in such a way that they seem to imply that the 10 Commandments had been finished with, even though the witnesses were still around, that the treaty had been broken. I want to tell you this morning that we are not under law, we are under grace, but where does that put us? Let me tell you, I used to think that law was here and grace was there, and if I wasn't under law, I'd moved somewhere and I was under grace over here. Now I've realized that grace and law are not apart from each other horizontally, they are apart from each other vertically. So if I'm not under law, but under grace, where am I? I'm on top of the law. You with me? Now that's the good news. Instead of being under it and being crushed by the weight of those 2 stones, Instead of feeling the crushing, condemning weight of it all, Jesus says, I've come to put you on top of it. And you'll be under grace and you'll be on top of the law. We're not under the law anymore. It hasn't the power to crush us anymore. The sting of it has been taken away, because the sting of death is sin, and the sting of sin is the law, which tells you, you shall not. I remember an RAF apprentice asking me whether the story in Genesis 3 was true, that they were told not to touch the tree, and then they went and did it, and so on. And I said to him, I want you to imagine that you're in a library full of hundreds of books on every subject you're interested in. If you're interested in motorbikes, there's a whole shelf full. If you're interested in this, there's a whole shelf full. And there's this beautiful library, enough books for you to read for the rest of your life, and more than enough. And I'm going to put you in that library and shut the door and lock it and say you're there for life, and that you'll find plenty of food in there and plenty of books to read. And you wander around the library and you find just one book on a shelf, not to be read by anyone under 21. I said, what are you going to do in that library? He said, okay, Padre, I believe it. And he went away. I think of the two cowboys, who went to church across the prairies, and as they rode to church, they sang and whistled and yodeled as cowboys do. And when they got to church, there was a real sky pilot, an old-fashioned kind of sky pilot preaching, and he really hammered them with the 10 Commandments. And boy, did he take them through it. And he crushed them with the stones of the 10 Commandments. And they came out very silent and very quiet, and they rode home. And they'd gone about 20 miles before they even talked to each other. And then finally one said, well, gee, I guess I never broke the one on the graven images. And the other said, I didn't either. And with that, they began to whistle, and they began to sing, and by the time they got home, they were as happy as when they'd set out, just because they'd managed to keep one. At the opposite extreme was the country squire, who used to sit in his little Anglican parish church, and when the vicar went through the commandments, one by one, after each one, the squire shouted out, never did that, parson, never did that, parson. Thou shalt not kill, never did that, parson. Now then, of the 10 Commandments, which do you think is the one that is being most broken in England today? Just think about that one. Which do you think is the one being most broken? Shout out when you've thought of one. The first one? The last one? Any others? Pardon? Thou shalt not covet. Well, that's the last one. We've had the first and last. None in between? Adultery, idols? Right, would you now like to shout out which one you're having most difficulty with? Was it a different one from the one you thought was being broken most in England? The one that you have most difficulty with? Here's a letter from the press, quite recently. Somebody said, recently when I read the 10 Commandments, I realized something for the first time. Our British national way of life now breaks all of the 10 Commandments. The commandments say, put God first, let nothing take his place, respect his name, go to church on Sunday, do work on the rest, honor parents, respect human life, chastity is more loving than promiscuity, don't steal, be truthful, resist the temptation to be greedy. In fact, we do not put God first. We let all kinds of things take his place, money, property, power, pleasure. We think that regular church going is a bit odd. Work on Sundays is perhaps a good idea because it earns double time. And the idea is to get as much and do as little as possible. Parents are no better than we are, so why respect them? Why respect anyone or anything? The desirable thing is to get your own way by killings and bombings if necessary. Honesty is a mug's game in word or deed, and we are becoming greedier and greedier. Of course, there always have been people who've broken God's law, but it is a chilling thought that at present breaking God's law is so common that it can be called our national way of life. Perhaps even more chilling is the fact that we are ceasing to be ashamed of it. That's just a letter to the press. Let me tell you why God has directed us to this chapter this morning. If His people are going to occupy this land as He wants them to, He must have a people whose way of life has the 10 Commandments written all over them. It will not be enough to put them on your gatepost if they see you walk out of the gatepost and break them. It will not be enough to tie them on your forehead unless they are operating inside your forehead. It will not be enough to tie them on your arm as the Jews do to this day unless the hand on the end of that arm is not grasping and greedy. It will not be enough to put it on the doorpost so that as people go out and come in of your home, they can see the law. It will only be enough if written upon our lives and our families' lives are these commands. Now, when I first read this chapter, the first thing that came on me was an overwhelming feeling of sadness. And my sadness, I couldn't understand at first. I just felt so sad. Lord, why should I feel so sad on reading these? And then I realized, God just whispered in my ear, don't you realize, David, that none of these should have been necessary? None of them should have been necessary. And I suddenly realized how sad God was when He had to give them. None of them were necessary. When God made man and man walked upright among the creatures on earth and were the only creature that walks perfectly upright, and our eyes are at the front, and we can lift up our heads and praise God, we're the only creatures on planet earth that worship. When God made man, if only things had stayed that way, God looked at Adam in the garden and said, if only you would always feel this way. If only this was going to be our life together, but I know it's not. You're going to want experience of things that I don't want you to experience. That's the tragedy. The whole meaning of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it was a sacramental tree. I mean by that it was a physical tree, but it had spiritual effects from eating. It was as sacramental as taking bread and wine from this table. It's only physical bread and physical wine, but it has spiritual results. It even has physical results. You could die as a result of taking communion in this church. That's the Bible's teaching. It was a sacramental tree, but the heart of it was this. God, I'm not going to take your word for it that that experience is not for me and will do me harm. I will try it for myself and find out. And then there are those who say we've evolved since Genesis 3. That somehow mankind is on a moving escalator. Teilhard de Chardin was such a man. He was an archaeologist and a priest, and he believed that the whole of mankind was on a moving escalator, and we were evolving into something wonderful, and we were all on the up and up and up. I don't think we've got one tiny inch further than this, because my children and your children are following in our footsteps, and they're doing exactly what we did. We refuse to take the word of someone else. This experience is not for you. And if you take it, it'll damage you. It'll be bad for you. And I want you to live long in the land. I want it to be well with you. And in a parent's heart, it's one of the great tugs. Somebody wrote to me and said the worst thing about having children is that you see all your own faults developing in them. And boy, that's a serious word. That question that girl asked her mother, what did you do at my age that makes you so anxious about me? That's a devastating question. Let me be quite frank, because none of my children are here this morning. But we've had to make rules for our children because we love them. We're sad to have to. So we made a rule, 10:30 in, until you're a certain age. And 2 of them are out of that now. And the rule was not understood at first. And yet, praise God, it was obeyed. And it became a joke in our house, and is a joke. 10:29, the front door opens. But fair's fair. Coming back from Exeter, we had to break all speed limits to get in by 10:29, my wife and I. Hope you get the message. It's no use you're trying to teach your children to say thank you unless you say thank you and please. And so now we have to promise to be in by 10:29. But there's been a realization why we made that rule. There was a complaint, but that prevents me from going to parties. And I said, we're trying to protect you from the parties that you would go to. It's because we love you. It's because we have to protect you. Oh, there will come a day when we've got to trust our own upbringing and let them free. Isn't it sad that rules should be necessary at all? It means that there is a breakdown of trust and love. And we make the rules for this simple reason. If we could trust you, there'd be no rules. Or even more, if you could trust yourself. For in the last analysis, trust is trust in yourself. And it's because I dare not trust myself. It's because my wife dare not trust myself. We know that the children are going to have this problem. The wisdom we're praying for now is the wisdom every parent needs to pray for. Lord, when do we drop the rules? When do we set our child free? There comes a moment when that has to be done. And when you must trust and trust. See, something about law is contrary to trust. Law is only necessary because there's been a breakdown somewhere in a loving, trusting relationship. And that's when the rules come in. And that if there was a loving, trusting relationship all around, then there'd be no need for the laws. And this is why God was so sad to have to give these 10 commandments. He gave them out of sheer love. He said, it's because I want everything to be well with you. I want you to live long in the land. I want you to enjoy life. But so twisted is our human nature that when we first read the 10 commandments, we say, God, you're the kind of God who wants to stop me enjoying myself. That's the impression I get. And I don't understand. Do you remember Ern Baxter standing in this very pulpit and saying he hated his father because his father would not let him go out after a certain hour with his friends, and he hated him and resented it for years? But every one of those friends has finished up in jail for stealing cars, and they stole them in those very hours when Ern Baxter's father wouldn't let him out. And he said, now, I love my father more than ever because he loved me enough to say, I'm going to keep you from that, son. But you can't do that forever. There comes a time when you have to let your children go. And sometimes that's terribly hurtful. I think of Luke 15, and the most incredible thing in that chapter is, and he divided unto them his money. He must have known what the younger boy would do. He didn't live with him for nothing. He was a father. He knew what kind of a boy he'd bred. And he must have known the boy would head straight for the nearest big city and straight for the brothels in that city. He must have known it. And he could so easily have said, now look, as long as I'm alive, I'm going to control my money. You'll get it when I'm dead. What you do with it after that is on your account. But he said, while I've got control of it, you're not going to do that with it. I'll keep it. But no, the father realized the time had come when he must let the boy go and trust. And everything he thought would happen did happen. But I tell you this, he got his boy back. My prayer for every parent listening to me this morning is to know when to relax the rules and when to trust. You have a sacred responsibility up to a certain point to apply rules. And then God will say to you, and you need to hear very clearly when he says it, let them go now. And let me be their father. Graham Pulkingham had a son whose attitudes was wrecking the family life. He was moody, he was resentful, he was bitter. He was 19, he was only living at home because it was cheaper than living elsewhere. And Graham was really troubled about this, and he said, Lord, what shall I do? And the Lord told him, and Graham said, I can't do that. But the Lord said, you must. They had 2 cars, a good one and an old family jalopy that they used for running around in. And Graham Pulkingham called his son into his study, and he gave him the car key for the second car, and he gave him $100, and he said, go. And the boy walked out of his home. And Graham couldn't sleep for weeks after that. He thought, what have I done? Where have I sent my boy? He didn't know, he didn't hear from him. The boy wandered around the world, and he finished up in New Zealand, almost as far from home as he could get. And there he met Jesus. And Graham got his son back. You see, When you make rules, you're having to treat somebody as children. And God, because man grabbed at experiences that God said they'll do you no good. They're not good for you. You're not to touch this tree. You're not to know evil for yourself. I want you to know the sheer joy of innocence. Because once you lose your innocence, you can never, never recapture it. Lose the joy of chastity and you can never again recapture it. You can never again be the same. You've lost something beautiful. And though it can be forgiven and mended, and God can do wonders and make all things work together for good, you can never go back to the joy of innocence. And this applies to everything God says no about. He says, it'll do you no good. I don't want you to know evil. I just want you to know good. And man said, no, I'll decide for myself. I'll experience both and then I'll decide. The trouble is when you've experienced both, you can't decide to enjoy good. That is the problem. You can't go back to where you were and have the choice again. It's gone. And so God had to say to the children of Israel, I'm going to start with you as a little chunk of my family, and I'm afraid I've got to treat you as kids, and I've got to make rules, and they're for your good. Do you really believe and see that God gave His commandments to help us to enjoy life, not to spoil our fun, but to enable real life to be enjoyed? And He says to the children of Israel, when you go into that land, I want you to enjoy life. And therefore don't touch these things. I want you to enjoy life. And when everybody else around you is breaking these things and saying, this is fun, this is life, this is for kicks, I want them to come hungry to you and say, you know, we've been wrong. We've been wrong. Now, why did God repeat the 10 Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy? Tell you why. He told one generation in Sinai who 10 days later should have been in the promised land, but instead they had not gone in. They'd moved around for 40 years and a whole generation had died, and God had to tell them again. But why did He have to give the 10 Commandments just before they entered the promised land and not when they left Egypt? Why didn't He tell them on the other side of the Red Sea, now this is the way you're going to have to live? Because frankly, the pressures would not be on them to break these commandments fully until they were in the promised land. Archaeology has now revealed a great deal to us about the character of life in the land of Canaan before they moved in. And we now know that the people whom God ordered destroyed deserved to be destroyed. We now know the character of the life in Canaan, and it was horrible. They were going to have to move from a barren wilderness where they rarely came up against people, and the only pressure on them had been the pressures from within their own fallen nature. The building of the golden calf into idolatry and the immorality that followed the idolatry, as it inevitably does. All that had come from pressure from within. And God had given the commandments first when the pressure from within was making them do these things. But God knew that when they got out into the land, they would be up against a pressure from outside as well. And if you combine the pressure from outside with the pressure from inside, you're in a very heavy situation. It is very difficult not to do what everybody else is wanting to do when you want to do it as well. And that's the situation they were going to move into if they were going to possess the land. And so God, just before they went in, said again, now listen to these 10 things. You can learn them on your fingers, but just listen to these 10 things. Get a hold of them, repeat them, grasp them, remember them, teach them, pass them on, write them on your doorsteps, write them everywhere you'll see them whenever you're going to do anything. If you're going to do anything out of doors, you'll see it on your doorpost. When you're going to do anything indoors, you'll see it there. Get it everywhere. Cover your whole life with these rules. Because He said it's going to be tough, very tough. And I've just read to you a letter from the press which tells you that if we are going to live the life that God wants us to live and occupy the land He wants us to occupy, then He's going to have a people who can resist not only the pressure from inside that wants to do things that are bad for us, but the pressure of everybody around us doing the same things. That's why we must write these laws so deeply. I don't have time to run through them. There are just one or two things I would say about them, that the heart of them is they are all designed to keep relationships intact. That's the heart of them. And if you understand that, you'll understand why God singled out these 10. They're all designed to hold people together in love and trust as they should be. They were given in love, given in love. That's why God said, here are 2 reasons why you should keep these, and they're tremendous reasons. Number 1, remember, I am the Lord who created you. I gave you life. That's the first reason. And second, I'm the Lord that redeemed you and rescued you from Egypt. If somebody gave me life and then rescued me, especially at the cost of his own life, and then said, do this, I think I'd have a pretty strong motivation. Let's imagine this. Supposing my father, who brought me into life, rescued me from danger at the cost of his own life, we'll say drowning, supposing I fell into the sea, and he was so overcome that his heart was overcome and he was dying. And I realized that not only had this man brought me into the world, but now he'd given me life again for a second time. And he said, son, it'll be worth it all if you'll just do this. And then he told me something he wanted doing. Wouldn't I want to do it? And so God applies the rules, but he applies them with such motivation that he says, look, I made you. Keep the Sabbath because I created the world. And then the second time he repeats it, he says, keep the Sabbath because I rescued you from Egypt. And you know, all these things were given for their good because he loved them. And the very first expression of his love was this. It was a marriage treaty, a marriage covenant between them. He says, will you keep yourself only to me as long as you both live? Will you please keep me first in your life? I'm jealous for you. One of the thoughts that has been very much with me the last few days, I've been thinking again and again about it, is the jealousy of God. God loves me so much, he's jealous. And he wants me for him only. He's jealous if somebody else gets me. And he's jealous for his people. And he says, no other gods I'll tolerate, no rivals. I won't have anyone else in the first place in your life. I'm first. I loved you. I made you. I remade you. I rescued you. You're mine, and I won't let anybody else have you. No other gods before me. Can you not feel the love in that commandment? He's not trying to kill your life. He's not trying to stop your fun. He's saying, I love you and I want you, and I don't want anybody else to have you. And then he says, don't try and think of how I'm like. He said, your little minds are too small to imagine what I'm like. Your imagination is not big enough to contain me, God. So don't ever try and imagine or don't ever try and image me. Now, you know that's awfully difficult. It's much easier having a God you can see. It's much easier saying he's this shape and look at him. But it doesn't matter whatever image you think of God. If you finish up with an old man and a long beard on clouds, that's a libel on God. How do you think of God? God in his mercy said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you an image. Moses, they didn't get one, and for centuries they never had an image of God. They had nothing to look at. And then one day a man walked out of Nazareth, and people looked. And years later they realized they'd seen the express image of the invisible God. We've got an image, and it's the only one there is. And even that image we can't see this morning. Just as the Jews could only hear about God but not see him, so we are towards Jesus. But somehow I find it easier to imagine Jesus than God. Do you? My imagination can't stretch to imagine what God is like. He's so big. I've been quoted in the Family News this month as saying that God isn't somewhere in the universe is somewhere in God. Well, you know, it's a neat little cliche, and I think it says something true, but can you imagine what God is like from that statement? I can't. But I can imagine Jesus. And the image of Jesus helps me because I know that God is Jesus everywhere. And Jesus is God with a human face. So I've got the image. You shall not take my name in vain. Well, can you imagine my doing that? If I loved him and if I realized his love for me? Do you know, if I heard someone using my wife's name as a swear word, I don't know what I'd do. But I remember once being in a public convenience, and I heard a man just using awful language about Jesus, and he was just sending a sword through my heart. I didn't know quite what to do. And the Lord led me to whistle a tune, a hymn tune about Jesus. And he stopped. It hurts you to hear the name of someone you love used. And you know, when people just say, "Oh God," I think they're using his name in vain because they're not really meaning it. I've known men mean it. But so often it just means crikey or whatever. Or they'll use another name for God, Gad or Gosh. Or all these words are God words, you know. Using God's name for something he never intended to. We can do that so easily. If we offer him hollow worship, we're taking his name in vain. Awful things have been done in the name of God and in the name of Jesus. What hurts me most about Bamba Gascoigne's series on the Christians is just this, that he can pick up so many things that have been done in the name, and you just know that that name was never given to those things. The Inquisition was never something that Jesus would lend his name to, yet it was done in his name. Wars have been committed in his name. In Northern Ireland, his name is being used to justify violence and bombing, and I'm sure that's taking his name in vain. But before we point to others, let's ask, have we ever used his name in vain? To sing hollow things and not to mean them, and to go out and do the opposite is to take his name in vain. And God says, my name is the name of someone who loves you very dearly. Don't try and manipulate me to justify what you're doing. So I could go on. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy? You know, we find this a real kind of constricting thing. Oh, but I want to do this and that on Sunday. Well, I'll tell you good news in a moment, but I'll tell you the bad news first. God said 1 day in 7, as he said 1/10 of our money, he said 1/7 of our time. And as far as our money giving is concerned, if the Jews had to give 1/10 under the law, shall Christians give less under grace? And if the Jews had to give 1/7 of their time under law, shall Christians give less to God under grace? We've so much more reason to be thankful. But here's the thrilling thought that came to me. As slaves in Egypt, they had to work 7 days a week. And it was the love of God that said, you only need work 6. Do you get that thought? It wasn't a constriction, it was a freedom. He said, I want you to have a rest every week. They'd never had that in Egypt. And he said, I rescued you from slavery. And you know, there are men who on Sunday morning will be studying yesterday's Financial Times. They can't get a rest. They can't get away. They can't shut it off. And I tell you, you'll be physically healthier, mentally healthier, emotionally more stable if you'll take advantage of God's freedom to take a rest once a week. I'm not going to preach too strongly on 6 days shalt thou labor. I'll have the trade unions after me if I do. No, I'm not going to go through all these. Except to point out there are 4 that are concerned to keep the relationship with God right. There are 4 that are concerned to keep your relationship with your neighbors right. But again, it's just sheer love. How can I love my neighbor and murder him? How can I love him and pinch his wife from him? How can I love him and steal any of his property? How can I love him and want what he's got? If I love him, I'm just so glad he's got it. But between the 4 that are concerned with the relationship with God and the 4 that are concerned with the relationship to neighbors, there are 2 that are all about family life. As if God is saying the most important thing about you as people when you occupy the land will be your family life. And this has been something that even in their worst times has been so characteristic of the Jews. But it's going to be something that is so characteristic of Christians in this land, that those whose marriages are falling apart and whose children are rebelling and those whose families are breaking up will be able to see in us, in our weakness as well as in our strengths, the way that God wants family problems tackled. And that's going to save this society and give it stability. Now, for the first time, there are more marriages in registry offices than in churches, for the first time this year. Why? Because most of those marriages in registry offices are 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th marriages. And I've said it to you before, but every child has a right to loving parents. The rate of divorce is that now 1 out of every 3 will finish, usually within the first few years. 1 out of every 3. Do you know, psychologists have discovered that the security of a child lies not in the love the parents have for the children, but in the love the parents have for each other. Did you know that? As long as mum and dad love each other, they can almost ignore the children. The children will feel secure. But if mum and dad are not right, they may love their children as much as they can, but those kids are going to be insecure. And so God says, out of those 10 commandments, 4 are for me, 4 are for your neighbor, but 2 are to keep the family unit intact. And so there's to be no adultery. Kids have the right to a father and mother who stay together. And children, if you really want the secret, honor your parents. Realize that if they make rules, it's because they love you. Don't kick against it. I say a serious word now. Breaking God's law can affect 3 to 4 generations, and I dread to think what kind of a harvest we are going to have from the swinging 60s for the next 90 years. 3 to 4 generations. I went to visit a man in Mount Alvernia. He was dying. A lovely saint. I've never met such a lovely Christian. And some of the things he used to say to me talked about God in a way that I've never heard before. He would talk about God as Father. Oh, you say, I've heard that before. We say the Lord's Prayer in church every Sunday. But no, he didn't talk about him that way. I used to go into his room in Mount Alvernia, and he used to say, oh, hello. He said, I've just had such a lovely chat with Father. Or he would say, do you know what Father just told me? Father. Sweet relationship. And he said, I'm a dying man and I know it. And he said, you know, I'm the last. I'm the 4th generation. I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, 4 generations back, my great-grandfather really got into sin. And he said it has shown itself in every child all down. And he had given himself to prayer that God would bring the family line to a stop. And he said, you know that I and all my brothers and sisters are barren, and none of us have had any children. And I'm the last. And he said, the line has been stopped. And he was just dying happy that the effects of sin were going to be removed. That's a very, very deep thing. That's so deep that some of you will find yourself really disturbed by that. You'll almost find yourself hurt by that. But I looked into his face, and he was praising God that he was the last of his family tree, that the effects of sin would die with him. I was moved deeply by that. But it made me wonder, my sins will affect my children, my grandchildren, to my great-grandchildren. That's the bad news, but now for the good news. But for those who obey me, I will love thousands of generations. And the effect of a good man obeying the law can go on and on and on. That is why we've been able to live so long with an apparently Christian society in this country when the vast majority have ceased to be Christians, because spiritual capital lasts a long time. It's running out fast, but it lasts an awful long time. And it can go down through the generations. And the general standards of integrity and trust which enable us to use checkbooks, the general standards in this country still go back to nearly 2,000 years of the Christian presence in this country. And God is kind to generations, thousands of generations. So if you keep God's laws, you will never know how long that influence will last. And there are many people who today are decent people in this country who go nowhere near church and say no prayers and read no Bible. Why? Because way back in their history, there has been a man who kept God's laws. A man got up to me, I think it was in a factory. It was on a mission, and it was certainly not in a church. It was either in a factory or a working men's club. That's my vague memory. I think it was somewhere in Yorkshire. And a man heckled me. And he got up proudly and he said, and it wasn't the wrong kind of pride either, but he said kind of proudly, he said, you can ask my mates around here who they go to when they're in trouble. And there was a kind of murmur of approval, good old Joe or whatever his name was. And you can ask them who's the most generous and who's the kindest. And he said, I'm just saying this, and he wasn't saying it to boast. He said, I'm saying this because he said, I now tell you, I have no room for your Jesus, I have no room for your religion, and I can be all this and my mates will back me up. I said, Lord, give me the answer. And I asked him, did your grandpa go to church and read his Bible and say his prayers? And he hung his head. And he admitted yes. Think of the good that's going to go down through the generations. That little one about theft, I had no idea that the Hebrew word was man stealing. Thou shalt not man steal. It is a security word. Literally it says, thou shalt not kidnap, thou shalt not hijack. Does that begin to make it a little relevant? It covers stealing property, but the worst kind of stealing you can make is to steal a man and hold him to ransom, and it was to give security. Wouldn't you love to live in a world in which there was no murder, no adultery, no stealing, no false testimony, no gossip? Wouldn't you love to live in a world like that? Everybody would love to live in a world in which everybody else kept the 10 Commandments. Have you noticed this? And all these letters to the papers from retired colonels about mugging on the tube trains, Everybody would love to live in a world in which everybody else kept the 10 Commandments. But God is saying, this is the ideal society, these are my laws. But God is saying, oh, I wish you always felt like keeping them. I must hurry, I'm taking far too long. May I just say how Jesus came. Law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. It didn't take us away from law. It took us from under law and put us above law. Shall I tell you what Jesus did to do this? Shall I tell you how to keep the 10 Commandments? And I'm not telling you as one who is keeping them. Jesus, when he came, the first thing he did with the 10 Commandments was to make them stricter than ever. Stricter than ever. If he was going to get them done, he had to make them stricter than they were before. So he said, murder, if you call a man a fool, you're a murderer. If you wish you were dead, you're a murderer. Adulterer, if you look at a woman and wish you were in bed with her, you're an adulterer. And so he went through the commands. He made them so strict that every man just felt the crushing load so deeply. It seemed as if Jesus came to knock us further and further down and interpret those commands in a way that none of us could keep them. And then when he'd got us literally at rock bottom, with our backs against the rock on which the 10 Commandments were written, he did the next thing. He said, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And he forgave us. I was sharing last night a very personal experience. I share it with you again this morning. Forgive me if you were there last night. But earlier this year I had to go and confess a sin to a brother. And I didn't know how to face him, and I didn't know how to tell him. So I wrote it on a piece of paper and I wrote it out. And then I went and sat opposite him in the room, and I gave him the piece of paper, and I put my eyes down and just pushed it in his hand. And I thought, after he's read that, he won't want to know me. Shows how sin twists your thoughts about other people, doesn't it? And he read it through without a flicker of expression on his face, and he read it right through. And I thought, what are going to be his first words? And he didn't say anything. He tore the paper into little shreds, and he put a match to them, and he came and put his arm around me. And I knew the joy of forgiveness. And I didn't want to do that anymore. Now multiply that by all your sins. Take them to Jesus. If I may suggest a very practical thing, go through these commandments and write down whatever you've broken. Write it on a piece of paper. Go to Jesus, tear them up and put a match to it. Just do that at the bottom of your garden. Just do that. And you've begun, only begun, but you've begun to find out how to keep them. that woman caught in adultery. I once saw a horrible sight in Arabia. You hardly ever saw women out anyway, and when you did, they were covered head to toe. But I once saw a naked woman in the streets of a little Arab town called Ma'allah. And she was being dragged by her long hair along the pavement by a wild, shouting mob of men. And her back was being torn by the stones, and she was being dragged through the streets. And I was about 4 floors up, and I could hardly believe my eyes. And they went running round the corner, dragging this poor woman on the gravel. I said, "What are they doing?" "She's been found in adultery." "But they must have found the man too?" "Oh no, it's the woman who was punished." And I just saw Jesus in that situation, saying to those men, "Which of you is without sin?" And he didn't mean any sin. He wasn't meaning if you're not perfect, you can't judge, because that would rule out all magistrates and all police for a start. He was referring to what sin they had accused her of. And he was saying, okay, if any of you are innocent, you can get on with the stoning. And the eldest went first. You know, when you're young, you brazen things out much more readily, don't you? When you're older, you haven't the face to. They all left, and Jesus was busy scribbling on the ground in the dust, and he looked up and he said, "Well, where are your accusers?" "They've gone," she said. And he was the one man in position to stone her, the one man who could have done it, and the one man who could have said it's the law, and the one man who would have been doing justice to do it. And Jesus said, "I'm not going to condemn you. Go and don't do it again." She walked out a free woman. That's the first step, to realize that Jesus' reading of the commandments is even stricter than Moses, so you're at rock bottom. Then first step up is forgiveness. Second step up is, I want to give you the power to keep them. And so he puts within us his Holy Spirit, so that it's Jesus in me, and if there was one person who kept every commandment, it was Jesus. And we forget the pressures he must have been under, all the temptations we know. He's been tempted in all points like as we are, the pressures. But he says, I'm going to put my Spirit within you, so you don't need to. You've got the power to now. And then he does one thing even better than that. Not only does he set us free from the past by forgiveness, not only does he give us the power, but here's the best bit of all. It's not just the power to do a thing. He wants to give us the desire to do it. And that's the most beautiful thing of all. To bring us to the point not where we are willing to obey, because if we don't, we're for the high jump. Not to obey the commandments, because if we don't, we won't occupy the land. Not out of a sense of duty, but I delight to do thy will, O Lord. Instead of saying to God, your wish is my command. That's one stage of the Christian life that some of you may be in this morning. You've got to the point where you're willing to obey, because you know what will happen if you don't. You know that you'll miss life. And so you say to God, your wish is my command, but there's a higher stage to which the Holy Spirit can lift you. And it's the stage where you say to God, your command is my wish. And then you're through. And that's what the New Testament talks about. It repeats every one of the 10 commandments bar one. The one it doesn't repeat for Christians is the Sabbath. It just tells you the Sabbath now extends from 1 day a week to 7. Instead of it, as many Christians seem to imagine, you switch the Jewish Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, and that's the only difference Jesus made to the Sabbath rest. Oh, you've missed the whole point. I wish the Lord's Day Observance Society would have a campaign for the 6-day work observance and see what happened. My daughter said to me, next Sunday morning is your O observances? I said, no, it's not. We're not called to observances. We're called to the position where we say, your command is my wish. I'm not observing this. I'm gladly entering into it. I want to do it. And the New Testament, while it repeats the commandments, it doesn't repeat them in the order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It scatters them around. In the context of the new covenant, as Jeremiah says, a new covenant, I'm going to make a new covenant, not like the one I made with you in the old days. I'm going to write it in your hearts, not on stone, not on your doorposts, not on your gates, not on your foreheads, not on your arm, but in your heart. When it's written there, writing it in your heart means, I delight to do your will, O God. I delight to do your will. And to walk with thee is not grievous unto me, for I delight to do thy will. And he can do it. And when he's done that, you're through. You're under grace, and you're on top of the law. The law's not been abolished. Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish it. Heaven and earth witnessed it. And while heaven and earth are here, the 10 Commandments stand. Not one jot or one tittle will be taken away. But I came to make it come true. When it's written in your heart, you can throw the stones away. And you don't need them written up. The first church I became minister of, the first church in England I became minister of, I was in the Shetlands for a year. The first church in England I looked after was at Chertsey, not far from here. And when I went into the church, I was horrified. Up behind the preacher in beautiful Gothic lettering done in chocolate brown against a lovely dark grey background were the 10 Commandments. Somebody must have really spent hours painting them up. And I could see people's eyes wandering from me up to these things. And I could see the heaviness of them behind me. And if you go to that little Methodist church today, I'm afraid I think it's closed now. But if you went and looked inside, you'd see that we painted out the chocolate brown and the grey with a beautiful peach color. And I asked a local carpenter to make a cross, life-size. And this carpenter began to make this cross, and he said, he said, it changed my life. He said, I'd never made a cross before. And he said, all the while I was hammering and shaping it, I thought of the one who was nailed on it. Changed that man's life. And he staggered along to church carrying it. And we put it up there. And the commandments had gone. And the cross had come. It wasn't that the law was abolished, but now it could come true. And if this nation can see a people of God keeping the commandments because they love to, and they want to, and they've found that all is well with them and their descendants, and they live long in the land, I tell you, we shall have this nation desperately saying, tell us the secret. Tell us the secret. Otherwise, they will have to say, as Nietzsche said, I would be saved if Christians looked more saved. Lord Rank became a Christian, a real Christian, in the last few years of his life. I'd known him for many years because he was a prominent Methodist. And indeed, the cinema van and the caravan in which I lived and worked for 12 months among the miners of South Yorkshire was a gift from Rank. And we used Rank religious films. But in the last few years of his life, he was filled with the Holy Spirit. And Lord Rank and his wife wrote this prayer, composed by a pastor behind the Iron Curtain, and he and Lady Rank used it right up to her death, and then he used it up to his. And he said, it's so simple. Dear Heavenly Father, you always love me. I ask you for continuous faith, so that I may always be conscious that the Holy Spirit lives within me and will teach me to love Jesus, so that by keeping his word and walking in his way, I will learn no longer to trust in myself, but to place all my hopes and cares in your loving hands. I ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And Lord Rank died in peace, having walked in his ways and kept his commandments and wanted to for the last years of his life. Amen.